return of America's elephant. That's how many refer to wood bison.
In June 1980, 28 bison walked out of transport crates onto a dirt strip in the Northwest Territories, into a valley that hadn't held a wild one of them in over a century. The people who released them knew the habitat had spent 100 years drifting towards something the animals were no longer part of. What nobody knew yet was whether 28 animals were enough to reverse that drift, or whether the herd would simply disappear quietly into a landscape that had already learned to function without them. Within a year, the population had dropped to 14. What happened after that is the part of the story that takes 4 decades to fully tell, and it ends somewhere nobody planned for. What a wood bison actually is. Before the release makes any sense, the animal itself has to. Most people, if they picture a bison at all, picture the plains version, the one from the old photographs, standing on open grassland, the one the 19th century nearly wiped out entirely. But the wood bison is a different animal entirely. Larger and darker, shaped over thousands of years not for open prairie, the flat, treeless grassland that covers much of central North America, but for the boreal forest and wetland meadows of Canada's north, where winters run longer and harder than anything the plains subspecies was built for. The scale is worth stating plainly. A mature wood bison bull can exceed 2,000 pounds and stand close to 6 feet at the shoulder, making it the largest land mammal in North America, outweighing a grizzly bear and a moose both. The hump behind its head isn't just muscle, it's a functional tool, used to sweep snow aside in winter to reach the forage buried underneath, a behavior the plains subspecies never needed to develop because it rarely faced the same depth of snowpack. That physical difference is only part of the story, though. What made the wood bison genuinely irreplaceable wasn't its size. It was the specific work it did to the landscape just by living in it. When a herd moved through, meadow grass got cropped low and kept open. Dead vegetation got trampled into the soil. The animals rolled repeatedly in the same depressions of earth, carving out wallows that gradually deepened and filled with rainwater after rainstorms, turning into standing pools that became breeding habitat for amphibians and insects that couldn't have existed there otherwise. Their dung, spread across thousands of acres of landscape, transferred nitrogen from the plants they'd eaten back into the soil in a form other plants could use. A slow, continuous fertilization that no other animal in the ecosystem replicated at the same scale. None of that stopped dramatically when the bison disappeared. The meadows just slowly changed into something else. The wallows filled in, the nutrient cycling slowed, the land drifted, quietly and over decades, into a version of itself that looked normal only because nobody alive could remember what it had looked like before. That drift is what the airlift was designed to reverse, and understanding why it was worth reversing starts with understanding what the collapse that caused it actually looked like. The collapse. The animal that would eventually be airlifted back into the Nahani Valley didn't disappear overnight. It disappeared the way most large-scale wildlife losses actually happen, gradually, through commercial pressure and protection that arrived too late to stop the damage cleanly. The hide trade is where it started. By the mid-1800s, commercial hunters had already pushed across most of the continent following the same economic logic. Large animals and wilderness that offered protection only until the financial incentive to penetrate it became strong enough. The plains bison further south had already been devastated by the same calculation. When hunters moved north, the wood bison faced the same pressure in the same form. The numbers tell the story directly. A population estimated as high as 168,000 animals at its historic peak had been reduced by the early 1900s to somewhere between 250 and 300 individuals. Within a few decades, a species that had shaped northern ecosystems for thousands of years had been stripped from most of its range. Legislation appeared on paper starting in the 1890s, which sounds like a response. But paper protection and actual enforcement are different things. For years, the gap between them stayed wide, and the rules carried little real weight until rangers began to be hired and deployed in the following decades. Wood Buffalo National Park was established in 1922, specifically to shelter what remained. The idea was simple: give the surviving animals territory that was genuinely difficult to reach and manage it actively. For a few years, that seemed like it might be enough. Then came the decision that would define the next several decades of the subspecies story, and it came from inside the system that was supposed to be protecting them: the stake. The park that had been created to save the wood bison became the site of the decision that nearly finished them off entirely. Between 1925 and 1928, thousands of plains bison were transported into Wood Buffalo National Park. The reason had nothing to do with the wood bison. A separate reserve elsewhere was overcrowded, and moving animals into the park seemed like a practical solution to a logistical problem. The number transported was enormous, somewhere between 6,600 and 6,700 animals, many times the entire remaining wood bison population. The two subspecies were now sharing the same territory, and the consequences followed quickly. The plains bison and wood bison interbred, which began eroding the genetic distinctiveness that made the northern subspecies what it was. But the more immediately destructive problem was biological rather than genetic. The plains bison carried bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis, two diseases originally introduced into bison populations through contact with domestic cattle, and once the herds mixed, both spread through the population without any natural check. By the 1940s and into the 1950s, biologists examining the wood buffalo population had reached a conclusion that effectively closed the door on the subspecies. The genetically pure wood bison, the original northern animal, no longer existed as a distinct population. Hybridization, the interbreeding of two populations until neither remains genetically separate from the other, had done what the hunters hadn't quite managed to finish. That assessment turned out to be wrong. But the people who made it had no reason at the time to think so, and for years the wood bison was managed as though the pure bloodline had already been lost. The actual situation, it turned out, was stranger and more fortunate than anyone had reason to expect. The rediscovery.
Hundreds until a tiny herd was found in a remote section of Canada.
The discovery happened from the air. In 1957, a Canadian Wildlife Service aerial survey was flying over a remote stretch of Wood Buffalo National Park when the crew spotted something that shouldn't have been there. A herd of bison in an area cut off from the main park population by difficult terrain, a natural barrier of dense forest and river systems that had kept them isolated from the hybridized population for long enough to matter. When biologists reached the herd on the ground and tested the animals, the results were unexpected. These bison carried no bovine tuberculosis, no brucellosis, and their physical characteristics matched the pure wood bison type rather than the hybrid animals that now dominated the rest of the park. The isolation that had made them hard to find had also protected them from both the disease and the interbreeding that everyone had assumed had ended the pure bloodline entirely. The population was small. Estimates of the exact number vary across sources, with figures of 18, 23, and 37 appearing in different accounts depending on which phase of the salvage operation is being counted. The number was low enough to make the situation genuinely precarious, a founding group small enough that a single bad outbreak or a single difficult winter could have ended the story before it properly began. What followed was a salvage operation. Through the 1960s, animals from this isolated herd were carefully captured and moved to Elk Island National Park in Alberta. where they were held in quarantined, managed conditions specifically designed to preserve the subspecies for future reintroduction. That facility became the genetic repository every subsequent reintroduction herd in Canada and Alaska would trace back to, the source population for an effort that hadn't yet begun but was already being prepared for. The genetic arc. Elk Island National Park sits about an hour east of Edmonton, Alberta, a small, fenced reserve that most people drive past without stopping. It doesn't look like the center of anything significant. But from the 1960s onward, it became the most important single location in the wood bison's survival story. The place where the last pure animals were held and carefully bred, while the question of where to put them remained unanswered. Getting them there had required careful work. The animals captured from the isolated wood buffalo herd had to be moved without exposing them to disease and without losing the genetic diversity that a small founding group carries only in fragile proportion. Every animal that didn't survive the capture or the transfer was a permanent loss to a population that had no room for permanent losses. The facility wasn't set up for spectacle. It was set up for genetics. The captured animals were kept in quarantined conditions, separated from any population that might reintroduce disease or dilute the bloodline that had survived by accident in the park's remote interior. The goal wasn't to build a large herd quickly. It was to preserve enough genetic diversity in a small, healthy population that future reintroductions would have a viable founding stock to work from. Conservation management of holding a species in a controlled environment while preparing the conditions for its return somewhere else requires a specific patience. The animals at Elk Island weren't going anywhere for years. The work being done was invisible from the outside, a slow accumulation of healthy generations in a fenced park in Alberta, while the valleys and boreal meadows were eventually destined for continuing their quiet drift toward a different version of themselves. Every wood bison reintroduced anywhere in Canada or Alaska in the decades that followed traces its lineage back to that Elk Island population. The park became, in effect, a genetic archive for a subspecies the rest of the world had already written off, kept alive specifically for a future that hadn't been decided yet. By 1980, that future had a location: the Nahani release. In June 1980, a transport plane landed on a dirt strip near Nahani Butte in the Northwest Territories, and 28 wood bison walked out of their crates into a valley that had not held a wild one of them in over a century. The site had been chosen deliberately. The area around the Liard River offered boreal meadow habitat and river flat forage that matched what wood bison had historically used, open enough to support a grazing herd, remote enough to give them space to establish without immediate pressure from roads or settlement. The founding group was small, but the logic behind the release was straightforward. Get a viable number of healthy, disease-free animals into appropriate habitats and let the biology do the rest. What nobody stated publicly at the time was how close the whole effort came to failing within the first year. Within roughly 12 months of the release, the founding group had fragmented. Animals scattered, some were lost, and the population dropped to as few as 14 individuals. 14 animals in a landscape the size of a small country, with no guarantee the herd would stabilize before it fell below the threshold where recovery becomes statistically unlikely. The people monitoring the release watched that number and understood exactly what it meant. The herd held. It didn't just survive at 14, it began to grow. And as it grew, something else happened that the release team had hoped for but couldn't guarantee in advance. The animals began behaving like bison. Within months of the release, biologists documenting the herd were recording exactly the ecological work that had always been built around. Meadows being grazed low, wallows beginning to form in the soft ground near water, willow thickets trampled at the edges of the herd's range. The functional role of the species, the specific set of behaviors that make a wood bison something more than a large grazing animal, switched back on almost immediately. as though the landscape had been waiting for it. In 1989, 12 additional animals were brought in from Elk Island to reinforce the founding population. 9 years after that, in 1998, 59 more were released near Fort Liard, expanding the reintroduction effort across a wider section of the same regional ecosystem. The total founding population across the Nahani system, across all 3 releases combined, came to 99 animals. What those 99 animals would eventually become is the part of the story that took decades to fully measure. The unexpected part. The numbers are where this story stops being a conservation management story and starts being something harder to fully explain. By 2000, 20 years after 28 animals walked off a transport plane onto a dirt airstrip near Nahani Butte, the herd had passed 200 animals. That alone would have counted as a significant outcome by the standards of most reintroduction efforts, but the herd didn't stop at 200. A 2017 aerial survey estimated roughly 960 bison ranging across an area approaching 10,000 square kilometers. To put that in perspective, it's larger than Yellowstone National Park. A founding population of 99 animals, introduced across 3 separate releases over 18 years, had produced a self-sustaining wild population nearly 1,000 strong, occupying territory on a scale that nobody had formally planned for. Canada's official wildlife assessment reflects what the numbers showed. The wood bison's conservation status was downgraded from endangered to threatened, the first improvement in the subspecies' formal assessment history. It remains a conservation-dependent species, still requiring monitoring and management, but the direction of travel has reversed from the trajectory that had defined the previous century. Then came the part that genuinely surprised the researchers watching it. Bison from the Nahani founder line crossed the Liard River. This matters specifically because the Liard had been treated by wildlife managers as a natural barrier, a waterway wide and cold enough that bison weren't expected to cross it and establish permanently on the other side. They crossed it anyway, and the animals that made it across didn't just pass through. They stayed, formed a breeding population, and claimed territory in northeastern British Columbia that no human had selected for them, and no reintroduction plan had targeted. Wood bison descended from the original 28 now hold ground across 3 Canadian jurisdictions. The Nahani release has become the founding event for a range expansion that is still, as of the most recent surveys, continuing on its own terms. What the land does in response. The bison came back. What happened to the land around them is the part of this story that takes the longest to see and is hardest to attribute cleanly. But the direction of it is consistent across everything researchers have documented since the release. Over the century without bison, the Nahani Valley's meadows had been closing. Without a large grazing animal to keep them open, grassland edges crept toward forest. Old wallows, the shallow depressions the animals had carved into soft ground near water, filled in with sediment and vegetation and disappeared into the surrounding landscape. The nutrient cycling that bison dung had driven across thousands of acres slowed without its engine. None of this was dramatic. It changed what happens when something essential stops, and cumulative, until the absence becomes the new baseline, and nobody living remembers what the baseline used to be. With the bison back, that process is running in reverse. Meadows are being held open again along the herd's range, cropped low by grazing animals moving through on a seasonal pattern the landscape hadn't experienced in a century. Wallows are forming again in the soft ground near water, and the standing pools they create are supporting amphibian and insect life that had been absent from those specific patches of ground for generations. The mechanism behind this is better documented in a different ecosystem than the Nahani specifically, and that distinction is worth being honest about on screen. A 2022 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences tracked bison reintroduction on a Kansas prairie over nearly 3 decades and found that it roughly doubled native plant species counts compared to plots managed with cattle grazing or no grazing at all. That result is striking, but it comes from plains bison in open grassland, not wood bison in boreal forest. The ecosystems are different enough that the Kansas finding is suggestive of the same mechanism rather than a direct measurement of what's happening in the Nahanni Valley. What is directly documented in the Nahani region is the reversal of the drift. The meadows that spent a century becoming something else are becoming something closer to what they were. The wallows are back. The nutrient cycling is running again. A landscape that had reorganized itself around an absence is reorganizing itself around a presence, and the process is still underway. 28 bison walked out of those crates in 1980 into a valley built to test whether they'd survive. 45 years later, they've crossed rivers no one thought they would and started repairing a landscape on their own terms. Nobody planned that ending. The bison did.